Hello, welcome to episode 10 of the dystopian novel They Said There Was. And we're on chapter 33. Robert had to swing into action quickly because the news said the new rounds of injections were being given out, and there was no shortage this time to slow it down. The injections would be all done in a matter of weeks, and then travel could open up again to various destinations. This meant that Bruna would be arriving in just a few weeks, and the house was a mess. He was barely keeping up with washing enough dishes for his meals, and they always seemed to need washing again, which meant there were other things he didn't have time to keep up with. There were still piles of washing in the bedroom, which he didn't use anymore, but which Bruno would want to see like the rest of the house, and it all had to look good enough for her to pass inspection, so to speak. He dealt with most of the clothing by throwing it into black plastic bags and shoving it packed down tightly into the bin, which got collected every week. The other things, like socks and underpants that he needed, had to be washed. He found out how to do a hot wash and used the last of Deirdre's washing powder to make sure the smell came out. Some of the underwear and shirts and vests had black spots all over them, which was mysterious, but at least they could be washed, unlike suits. He'd seen his wife hang them in the utility room before, so he knew that. A very large pile of things remained heaped up beside the washing machine, after he'd fit as many things in as he could before pressing the start button. But at least the floor in the bedroom was visible now. Bruna, though, didn't appear. 2 days had passed, and she hadn't sent any messages. She must have gone straight on to Africa to work and had the ring with her, or got the hotel to send it on, or something. He was so busy panicking, to be honest, about the state of the house and how to fix it, that he hadn't worried too much. But after 4 days had passed, he did wonder why she wasn't contacting him. Did they not have internet in the village she was going to? Maybe if it was one of those backward places, far away from civilization. He wished he'd asked her the name of the place so he could see where she was. Was she at a hotel? Did they have hotels there? Hardly. Maybe some kind of dormitory for the nurses, or huts or something. It sounded awful. Then she would have to mix with poor people over there. She'd be much better off when she got work in a local hospital nearer to home. Why anyone would want to care for sick people was beyond him. He touched a tooth towards the back of his lower jaw, reminded of the fact he needed a filling done by the thought of sick people. He'd eaten a bar of chocolate with some sort of sugary stuff inside the day before that went right down into what he discovered was a big hole there, and it lit up his head with pain for a few hours. That would have to be dealt with too when things opened up again, because he'd noticed the dentists were closed last time, even though the doctor's offices were open for getting the injection at. More money going out, and maybe not enough to cover it, with Deirdre's health plan off the menu now. At least for him. Bruna's arrival would make these problems go away. As a nurse, she must have a health plan available. she could put him on to save money. He was glad he'd had his hair cut and bought his suits while he had the opportunity. He'd looked very scruffy, he was sure, with his hair so long and the ruined suits he'd had to bin. The back garden was a mess too, since she'd gone. Bruna would want to see the whole property. He'd have to get that under control as well. He was standing, hands on hips, wondering what to cut down or pull up first when he noticed the smoke. It seemed to be billowing into his garden from the next one. He peered through the thinnest part of the bush, also very overgrown, that Deirdre had put up as a border between the garden on one side, with spruce trees and some sort of apples or plums or something that she'd planted, on the other side, and saw the woman next door feeding a fire with large lengths of wood. She had one of those fire pit type things they sold in the garden centre part of the supermarket, in the middle of her very unkempt garden. Deirdre had made him wait once, rabbiting on about whether to get one or not, once when they'd been getting her fertiliser, before deciding not to buy it. Why on earth was she in the garden in October, balancing huge bits of logs on it, trying to start a fire? He knew she was a very odd person already, but this was too much. How was he supposed to get anything done in his own garden with all the smoke billowing around? It made no sense either. He looked around at Deirdre's garden again. There were a lot of leaves about, and he'd seen her sweeping them up before when looking out his office window occasionally when detecting movement past the window. He supposed you could burn them, maybe, to get rid of them, but Deirdre used to put them in a big pile in a corner, in a thing she called her worm heap. He hadn't asked what the purpose of that was, but they'd got a bin meant for things called compost, which meant any food you ate that you wanted to throw out, and anything involving plants, like the leaves, and grass after you'd cut the lawn. He, being in charge of the bins, since it was a job requiring men's strength to wheel them out the night before collection by the bin truck, knew you could put any sort of food in there that were bits you couldn't cook, because he'd seen Deirdre throw it in the green-coloured bin in the kitchen and remind him not to throw cooked food in once, when he wasn't able to eat one of her things and went to throw it in the wrong bin. She didn't collect huge logs to burn, though, dragging them in from God knows where just to make a smoky fire. He worked for a few hours at pulling things up, then mowing the lawn, which wasn't bumpy at all, as Deirdre claimed, but took a lawnmower perfectly well before heading back into the house to shower and eat, noticing his weekend trousers were filthy now. More to bloody wash. Was there no end to chores? While he was eating, he checked his phone for a message from Bruna. Nothing. It was a pity he didn't have a phone number for her. He could have rung her to see if she got the engagement ring and arrived in Africa yet. He was eager to have this phase of his life over, so he could get the old life back on a firmer footing, so to speak. He was exhausted after tackling the garden, and there was still more to do, perhaps hours more, just on that, tomorrow. Then trying to load the washing, and do another load, and another, and all the other things in the house to be made dust-free, non-sticky, and presentable. He'd had the presence of mind to send a large bunch of flowers to Bruna the day after sending the ring. That would cancel out the doctor's flowers perfectly, since he'd gone for the most expensive bouquet he could find, now that he knew how to shop on the site she'd shown him, and she'd told him what hotel she was staying at. He hoped the flowers had arrived before she'd left for Africa, because it was a waste of money he could ill afford. He'd checked his bank balance after buying the ring, and it was almost empty. He wasn't sure how he could pay for the car to be serviced after the other bills were paid. He'd never thought his electricity expensive before, but the bill that arrived that had to be paid within the next 2 weeks looked huge now against the tiny amount of his bank account. He was right down to the wire, as they say, and he needed Bruna to contact him. She was missing. 2 weeks went by, and still he'd heard nothing. Perhaps she'd been kidnapped by some primitive tribe. They liked white women, he felt sure. He'd remembered black and white movies Deirdre and he had watched in the flat they lived in when first married, where they captured white people and ate them after boiling them in a pot. Maybe they didn't do exactly that these days, but they weren't like us, he knew. Africa was one of those far away, primitive places, and not exotic and having big cities and civilizations close by like Rome or France had. If they raped and killed her, where would he be then? It didn't bear thinking about, and he was nearly glad of the horror of trying to get the clothing clean and the garden looking trimmed down, just to ease the worry about it. It helped to have work to do, even though it wasn't paid. It would pay off soon if she turned up. He reassured himself that he was probably panicking about nothing and that it was bound to be just that she had no internet connection because the Africans didn't have internet. The house was more or less finished after he'd put 2 weeks' work into it. He'd eventually located where the furniture polish was, and the air freshener made it smell clean as well. He had the surfaces of tables and shelves looking shiny, and the bedclothes on the bed were fresh now, because he'd found where the sheets and covers for the bedspread and things were kept, while trying to find places to put his dry clothes away. He'd had to throw out a lot of the things he'd washed, which the big black spots didn't come out of, but this made it easier to put things away neatly, so this was good in a way. The bedroom floor was visible, and the laundry basket thing only half full, because he was going easy on changing underwear and socks, changing them only when they started to smell, to save having to wash them again. He'd spruce himself up just before Bruno's arrival and get the new suit on, and even clean his new shoes now that he had found where the shoe polish with the tiny brush and cloth in a bag were located, under the sink, with washing liquid for dishes and some cloths and plastic bags. He was getting everything under control. Chapter 34. The country had opened up again, and there was still no sign of Bruna. She should have contacted him weeks ago. He'd gone to her metaversal environment profile page, but the link said no user when he clicked into her last messages to get there. How could there be no user when he'd spoken to her just a couple of weeks ago? And if she decided to become another character, like a cowgirl instead of a cat licking a lollipop, why had she not contacted him to tell him? The awful suspicion that she'd gone away on holiday with the rich and attractive doctor began to creep up on him as the days went by with no sign of her, and he imagined her sailing the seas with the doctor on a luxury cruise. What about the ring? The doctor wouldn't want to woo her if she was engaged, surely. She was either hiding it from him to get her free holiday, or maybe, he thought, had sold the ring and decided the other guy was a better bet, being a doctor and all that. He should have made himself seem more attractive a prospect, he realised, if he was to compete with a doctor. A woman that attractive, physically, and with an inheritance coming, could pick and choose what man she wanted. unless you had a lot of money and were admired by a lot of people, like doctors working to save people from the virus were, being considered heroes if the news reports were anything to go by. You weren't important to women. Even your own wife, he thought, feeling angrier the more he thought about the unfairness of it, doesn't appreciate you most of the time. He should have talked up his job a bit. He didn't want to admit he wasn't working at the moment when he told her things about his life, but he should have said he was in a managerial position and had a lot of staff under him. That would have impressed her. He wasn't sure he could have pulled that off well, though, if she questioned him about it. And she would have found out he wasn't a manager anyway when he married her. So that wouldn't have been an option, even if he'd thought of it at the time. He thought she loved him and wanted to marry him. So he thought he'd done enough work to make her want to be his wife. Then some bastard doctor swoops in, just like that, after all the presents he bought her, and the time he'd spent being nice to her, all for nothing. He burned up in his bed over the next few nights. He was enraged at the thought of the doctor, who already had money and didn't need hers, getting her. He probably could have any other nurse he wanted, but the fact he chose that one made Robert realise how much he'd lost by not getting Bruna. The thought of the money he'd spent made him more enraged and sleepless, and his camp bed seemed more like a burning bed of coals than a place to rest. He was tortured during the day as well, because he couldn't get the thought of the doctor and her on their cruise out of his mind. He hoped against hope that she would reappear, and checked her website, writing emails to it that went unanswered, and then back to her metaversal account, which had also gone. They'd never spoken on the phone, so he didn't have a number to call her on. He could still get to the jungle beside the waterfall in the metaversal environment, but he couldn't find her there, and walked around like a lonesome cowboy, looking for his bikini-clad nurse, but couldn't find her anywhere. He couldn't get the car serviced when travel restrictions lifted. He hadn't enough money. He'd barely enough to pay the other bills, and very little left in his savings to pay for food. There was no phone call from the Human Resource Office to tell him to come back to work either. He had no idea what he was going to do next. He was one of the unemployed that he hated now, but couldn't even apply to be one, because that would be too humiliating for a man like him. He thought of himself making his way to the Human Resource Office and saying the words, "I'm unemployed," at the front counter, and shuddered. He could imagine how they'd look at him, especially knowing he'd worked there. They would treat him like one of the great unwashed, and he would be labelled in their minds forever as unemployed, and officially in their files as a failure in life. He hoped, with increasing pessimism, that she'd turn up. He continued to finish cleaning the house and tidying the garden, just in case she messaged him after some unforeseen circumstance that, once explained, would clear everything up and put them back on track with their marriage plans. As he took another visit to finish tidying up the mess of weeds his wife had left behind her, he began to notice the smoke again. Peering through the thin spot in the bushes revealed the scruffy woman next door, back at her strange fire, burning more logs. She appeared to be cooking something on it. There was a saucepan balanced over the logs, which she was leaning over, holding the handle with gloves on, like the gardening gloves his wife often wore on her way to the garden. He'd never seen his wife do anything like this in her garden, he thought. I mean, he said to himself, why would anyone be cooking in their garden when they had a cooker inside the house? It was definitely something edible or drinkable because she was tasting it after stirring it, blowing on the spoon before bringing it to her mouth. This woman got stranger all the time. He marked it down in his notebook later on with the notes of what she was doing and what date. It might even be illegal to be lighting a fire outside and having all that smoke billowing into neighbours' gardens, and a spark could set the other houses on fire. The police might even call into the houses on either side of her if they got reports about it to get official statements from the neighbours about her other activities they might have observed. He hoped they wouldn't call to his door to ask, because he didn't really want them to think him suspicious somehow just because he was watching her through the hedge. They might ask him why. Better to keep notes on her to himself and just continue to observe, to see if he could make sense of it or get more evidence of her breaking the rules, going out of her house without a mask on, for example, if he kept a sharp eye out for movement. While in the living room, he might see more sightings of her doing that, and it would look more natural for him to mention it if police asked. A week, then a bit more, went by. It had been almost 3 weeks now since their last conversation. He was feeling more and more that she had taken advantage of his good nature and had run off with the doctor and his ring he'd bought for her. He was in a dire position now, financially. For the first time ever, he couldn't pay his electricity bill and had no car on the road because he could neither pay for the servicing nor the tax on it afterwards. Even getting food would be a struggle. He now knew what food cost from looking at the labels on things he bought at the local shop, and even the last few things he knew how to cook wouldn't last. He couldn't even afford washing powder to finish off the remaining clothing in the heap piled up in the utility room, because it was an extortionate price when he found it in the local shop, and he would not have enough money even for the month if he spent any of his remaining budget on that. He'd have to stick to the basics. Each visit he took to the shops required his phone now, because they'd installed the new swipe machines to scan the vaccine barcode on it before you got in. There was a new door to the shop, which opened automatically once the code had been accepted. He wondered how he was going to pay for the phone next month if he didn't have enough for the next electricity bill. The batteries in the phone didn't last very long, not when you were all day looking at the news, and in Metaversal, at least before Bruna disappeared all evening. It was hard to grasp, but he understood that electricity got cut off if you didn't pay the bill in time. He'd had a red message appear at the bottom of the last one, warning that the bill was overdue and had to go to the postal office to pay a little bit of it rather than the whole thing as he normally would, hoping that something would turn up work-wise that would fix his problem with finances. But what? Being among the ranks of the great unwashed, the unemployed, was absolutely out of the question. And even if he could humiliate himself enough to go to the Human Welfare Office to apply to be an unemployed, they'd probably tell him he wasn't looking hard enough and not really trying to get work, that there was plenty of work out there if he looked, and all the other things they were supposed to say to people. to get them to go away and not to accept his application. He'd tried to look. Lord knows he'd tried. He'd spent a lot of each day over the last few weeks finding out where to find jobs, looking up human resource jobs, trying to make a resume to upload, as the sites they advertised jobs on told you to do. But he hadn't received even one reply, although he'd applied for dozens. It was bewildering, given his experience in human resources. Admittedly, a lot of the job descriptions and requirements included all kinds of computer terms for software he didn't understand, and he'd had to look up the names of software they'd mentioned that they said they wanted the prospective employee to have official qualifications in. He had only used whatever software they used in work, and he wasn't sure if it had a name. He'd applied anyway, thinking he might be able to impress them with his experience if he could only get an interview. Nobody else could travel now either, so it was not just him with his parked useless car that was trapped. The whole country was to shut down for winter because the new jabs weren't working as well as expected either, because they hadn't caught all the jab evaders, the refuseniks, yet. Those bastards were holding the whole country to ransom and stopping everyone returning to their normal lives. He could see the news programs agreed totally with him on that, because although they didn't use bad language, they said pretty much the same thing. It was disgraceful that so few people evading the law were holding the country back and risking everyone's health. It was all their fault. The whole endless cycle of trying to get back on our feet and them holding us all back. He wished the people like the woman next door would just die so that they could live. He often went out in the back garden now to see if she was there and spy on her if she was. She wasn't always there, but she had things moving around her garden a lot. Piles of logs, cooking pots, bits of tools like a saw, and something that looked like it was a knife that folded up into something else for cutting. Then bits of furniture strewn around, and camping stools. Rocks moved around, ashes from the fire. She had garden beds like Deirdre, with bits of weeds in them like Deirdre, and in other areas the grass was left long and straggly. He thought of Deirdre and hoped she would die too. She'd been lax about masks and probably mixed with hippies like the woman next door that didn't wear masks either and would be arrested and kept out of shops until they got their jabs. Serve them right if they had to get the police at them to haul them away, to stop them endangering others. She spotted him one day. He tried to move back, but he could see her pause and look up from where she was cooking, then stare straight at the bush. He ran back into the house, alarmed at being caught. Chapter 35. He was caught in a far, far more embarrassing way later on. A few weeks had passed, and he was aware of how little money he had left, and made a very foolish decision that nearly got him arrested himself. He'd not been thinking straight, because he'd been so angry about Bruna taking him for a fool and running away with the last of his savings to her doctor. He needed food and knew he didn't have enough money left for the month. The temptation wasn't so much a plan as a spur-of-the-moment idea. He'd never stolen anything before, as he wasn't a thief, and it had been under a very high-pressured financial circumstance when he suddenly slipped the cheese into his raincoat pocket. It had been cold and rainy that day, he remembered, and there was nothing in the house to eat. Milk and bread was needed, but the cheese to go in the sandwich brought the bill up to an unacceptable amount, and the cheese was such a small packet that slipped into the raincoat pocket so easily that he had done it without considering the possible consequences. By accident, as it were. He was at the back of the shop, the cold fridge being at the furthest point from the counter where you paid, and he was thinking about how much the bread and milk was as he reached for the cheese to add to his basket. His hand paused over it a moment, and he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up like antennae, feeling for whether any other customers were near him. Then his hand was down. He was looking left and right, just to check, before casually putting his hand in his pocket. Nobody had seen him, and he turned and stared for a moment at a shelf that was filled with dog food tins, waiting for his heart to slow down a little and his face to feel cooler before making his way up to the counter. By the time his milk and bread were being packed by the old man behind the counter, he was feeling more himself. He would be out the door and on his way home, having pulled one over on them for having such ridiculous prices. He deserved a proper meal, and they had no right to prevent him eating with their stupid prices. Just the bread seemed like a luxury now, and he'd wondered before he left the house whether he could tolerate tea without milk, because he knew how expensive that would be as well. He wouldn't have had enough, possibly, in his account to cover cheese as well, as he couldn't remember how much that was until he saw the label and balked at it, calculating quickly that he was down to the very bottom of the barrel savings-wise and wouldn't afford to buy another meal when the bread and milk were gone. The old man behind the counter wasn't handing him the plastic bag. Instead, he said, "Have you forgotten the cheese?" He said it in a pleasant way, but Robert knew he'd been seen slipping it into his pocket. How could the old man have seen him from there? He couldn't have. Not only was he old and wearing extremely thick glasses, which implied he couldn't see past the end of his own nose, he'd been still all the way up at the counter. Robert had checked that when he turned to make sure nobody had been watching. "What cheese? I didn't buy cheese," he said coldly, hoping his stern tone with the old man would be enough to get him out of the shop to safety. "It's in your pocket." The old man didn't look quite as friendly anymore. He'd stopped smiling and was pointing. "Do you want me to jog your memory? I saw you put it there. Maybe you made a mistake," he added, his eyebrows raised in the way you expected when someone was surprised. He was giving Robert a way out. Robert looked at where the old man was pointing and saw what he was pointing at. A screen attached to the ceiling above a shelf with cakes on it that Robert had never seen before. It had lots of small frames showing, with images of different parts of the shop showing. "We had it installed when we got the scanner," the old man at the counter said. "Oh, cheese! Oh, God, yes. I forgot." Robert's hands were shaking as he withdrew the cheese from his pocket and placed it on the counter. He knew he didn't have enough to pay for it, but had to pretend he had so the police wouldn't be called. "I was thinking about something else, and I must have forgotten." His voice was shaking as much as his hands were now. Well, we all forget things sometimes. The man behind the plastic screen was not going to call the police, it seemed. Robert was going to get out of this terrible situation by the skin of his teeth, as they say. After all, what a stupid risk he had taken. The bill was totted up, and Robert went through the ritual of scanning his credit card on the machine, knowing it was not topped up with enough funds to pay for 3 small items. He ran his tongue over his dry mouth while he waited, knowing the card would be refused. He had some cash on him, but only pennies, and didn't want to stay in the shop longer, having to pay separately for the last item, as he still wouldn't have enough. His credit card was down to the last few pounds. When the credit card was rejected by the machine, he had to pretend it was a mistake, saying he'd forgotten perhaps to put his wages in, or made a mistake with the bill he'd paid at the wrong time before payday or something. And the man said, "We all make mistakes sometimes. Do you want to leave something back?" Robert pushed the cheese back under the slot below the screen where the rest of the food had been packed into the bag. Then the old man totted it again, and, thank God, the card was accepted by the scanner. Robert said, "Thank you," stiffly, and left the shop. How he would ever be able to go into that shop again, he didn't know. He didn't have the money to, he realised, as he only now had the small change that was rattling in his pocket to his name. And the man in the shop knew he'd tried to rob something. He'd never felt so humiliated in his life. After a frantic inventory taken to establish what food items he still had in the cupboards and shelves in the kitchen and the freezer compartment of the fridge, which included counting how many slices of bread were in the loaf, he could see how bad the situation was, worse than he'd even imagined. There was some food, but much of it he had no idea how to prepare. He'd never made porridge oats, and you couldn't eat them straight out of the packet, surely, because they looked all dried up. There was rice, which came dried out as well. He'd have to eat his way through things he didn't want or know how to prepare just to feed himself when the bread was gone. There weren't even eggs to have scrambled eggs with the bread, just bread and some butter left. He read the back of the porridge packet as he was eating his toasted bread and butter, trying to understand how to cook it. Had he sugar to put in it? He thought so. He'd never liked porridge. You needed milk to go on it too, or it tasted like nothing, he remembered. That would use up more of the milk. He thought again of Bruna later. The fear of thinking the shopkeeper might call the police on him about the cheese made him wish he could report her to police and get his money back, and her punished for robbing him. It was her fault he was in this terrible mess. Her and her false promises, and her fancy man, the doctor, robbing him blind so they could laugh at his trust in her and the promise to marry him that she'd broken. They thought him a fool, and getting the police to her was what she deserved. He needed all the money back too, the loans and the ring as well. He didn't want to tell the police, though. He'd be thought a fool by them as well, and it might even be a joke in the neighbourhood, or even the papers, if they knew he'd been conned by a prostitute. She was no better than a prostitute after all, hanging about in her underwear, getting all those loans from him that weren't really loans, it turned out, and all those gifts and the ring. The full humiliation of remembering all the things she'd said to him and about him as Buffalo Bill struck him like a series of repeated punches to his gut over the next few weeks. He walked around trying not to think of it, but could think of little else, even when he was trying to figure out how to cook the remaining food, and swallowing the porridge was bitter and choking, even with sugar in it and the last of the milk, before he had to go without that too. The world was so unfair. He'd worked so hard and now had nothing, just the house. That would go too, within months possibly, because he couldn't pay the next round of bills that were arriving in his door, and those owed wouldn't keep providing services for long, he thought. He was not only an unemployed, he was about to be a homeless too. Everything he'd believed in had turned on him for no reason, after he'd done all he could and more to be a perfect citizen. He couldn't even sell his car to raise money because nobody wanted a car that didn't have a service and insurance on it, according to what he saw on the advertisement sites he tried to sell it on. His job applications were going unanswered still, and when his next bill for the internet arrived, he wouldn't be able to pay it. The rent for the house, the food, the car, the internet, the electricity. He couldn't pay for any of these. And when you couldn't pay for something, you didn't get it anymore. He lay on the bed when he wasn't pacing the house, trying to think of a solution. He couldn't go to the Human Welfare Office and become a beggar, looking for a handout. He would never get back into decent society again if he did. They joked about it at the office so much that you were a lifer loser once you started taking handouts, and he knew the ridicule that would cause. The whole neighbourhood would probably find out he was an unemployed. At least they never had to find out about that whore, Bruna, and have that to jeer him about. He had to keep up appearances to have any chance of recovery if someone answered his applications for jobs, and never let on he'd been fired. He hadn't known what to say on his application forms, so he pretended he still worked at the Human Welfare Office and just wanted a change to something else, but couldn't really think up a reason why. And it didn't sound very convincing, this attempt to disguise the fact he hadn't been in work for so long and was basically now an unemployed. Nobody could know, because he could never live with the shame of it if they did. He fantasized about ways to kill Bruna and Deirdre sometimes, when he lay burning with shame on his camp bed. It passed nights because he only seemed to be able to sleep for a while in the afternoons. He felt the world was torturing him for a crime he never committed. He seemed to be existing in another world now, from the one he'd known, and there was no solid ground underfoot. He woke, startled from dreams of Bruna, with Deirdre's blonde hair, leaning over him, trying to kiss him several times. They even tortured him in his dreams. He'd lost interest in the news. Everyone was getting injections again because the virus hadn't gone away, but none of it had any relevance at all to him anymore. He had nowhere to go. and nothing he wanted to do. His days were empty, but filled with confusion, and he thought there was some way out that he could find, as his dream suggested. But he could never find the door in his dreams, nor when awake. Just this strange paralysis that seemed to be everywhere, as if everyone in the world had already died, and he was the last man standing, waiting for his turn to die. He couldn't stand, sit, or feel comfortable, and he walked around the house as if the solution was hiding from him somewhere, and he might find it eventually if he kept circling.